All right. G'day. Welcome back to Collectivitis podcast, where we dissect the disease that is collectivism. My name's Pietro. This is Max. How you doing, Max?
Not too bad, Pietro. Good to be back, like always.
Good to be back. Well, you guys wouldn't have seen it, but I just watched Max finish his breakfast. So Max is fueled up and ready to go and ready to talk about the big issues today. And
Ready to talk about my breakfast.
yeah, there's some huge stuff in the news that we really want to talk about. But first, let's break down Max's breakfast. So what'd you have, Max?
Vegemite toast. Nothing exciting, but it's just a staple every morning. Can't go wrong.
Vegemite toast, truly a national icon.
Oh, I'm just a nationalist.
I'm a patriot, okay?
Yeah.
Vegemite toast. That's what I have. Even if I hate it, even if I think it's disgusting, I'm having Vegemite toast because I was born on this goddamn Australian land.
And all 27 fucking million Australians should have Vegemite toast 3 meals a day.
Okay,
And if you don't, you hate this
Aussie
country.
yeah. All right, let's get into it. Because there is some big stuff. There's some big stuff. The biggest one is one that's just happened. It was the talk of the town, even before it happened, and part of the reason why it's so important and notable is before it was notable even before it had happened at all. So the interview between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin went live yesterday for us at the time of recording this. Got a chance to watch it. And I suppose the point before we even get into what was said in the interview is that this was a huge deal simply by virtue of it having happened, right? Think about the context of what's surrounding Putin and the Ukraine war. There's been for 2+ years now this narrative that Putin is a madman. He is a psychopath who wants to take over the world. You can't listen to him because he is nothing but a propagandist and a liar, and he just wants to mass murder and take over all of Europe if he could. If he can, and if we allow him, he will do this. And if Australians and Americans and all of Europe and everyone else who's part of the Western world doesn't send aid to Ukraine to protect Ukraine, then eventually it will be our own soldiers fighting in Europe, and it'll be the Russians on our home soil, and all of this narrative around why the Ukraine war had to be funded and had to be fought, and the fact that it was all completely unprovoked and Putin on a whim just decided one day to roll into Ukraine. And never, ever, ever was there any Western interest in Western media interest in talking to Putin and sort of hearing his grievances and his side of the story. Now, I understand if you're dealing with someone who doesn't hold free elections in their country and someone who is ostensibly a dictator in their country, you don't necessarily want to agree with them, but the very least you are obliged to do is to listen to what they're saying. Right. The first let's say, so I'm a teacher, right? I'm a high school teacher. If I have a kid who comes up to me and says, "Hey, I've been punched in the back of the head at recess by this other kid," the first thing that I do is I go and see what the other kid says happened. I don't say, "Okay, you've been punched in the back of the head. Someone gag that other kid so he can't talk. Don't let anyone listen to him. Nobody listen to him.
Then send the first kid $100 million in aid.
Send the first kid $100 million in aid from your wages, from your taxpayers, so your wages as the teacher. Gag the other kid and then start a war with him, and never ever ever let him speak or hear his side of the story, right? And what's more is, if you consider the situation with Ukraine, which is so much more complicated, and we'll get into this stuff as well, but a lot of the conflict is predicated on the fact that since the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russians, the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russians lost. The USSR collapsed. They surrendered. And part of the surrender was done with the assurances that NATO, so, the Western Alliance, would not move further to the east. It was kind of like a maintaining dignity and maintaining the security of your borders while there was this delicate period of the surrender and of the collapse going on, was that NATO would not move an inch to the east. And over the years, this happened again and again and again. And for the most part, Russia could not really do anything or say anything or have any sort of reaction. They could talk about it. They could say, hey, this was not meant to happen. This is the opposite of what was agreed upon and blah, 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 blah. But they surrendered. They were not a world power anymore. They had lost this war, and to the victor go the spoils. You can kind of do whatever you want. And NATO moved further and further to the east. And we'll get into it as well. But part of Putin's argument, and part of the argument that has been made by all of the best anti-war libertarians, your Dave Smiths, your Scott Hortons, your Tom Woods, all of them, even before this interview, like nothing to do, well before this interview, and was that having these NATO and US bases appear in Ukraine, and the revolution that was spurred on by the US in 2014 to overthrow their democratically elected president, all of this was part of was seen as pushing Russia to the point where they could no longer accept it. And it was, the Ukraine for them was the line in the sand, was the thick red line that could not be crossed. And you need to ignore all of this context and all of this background and all of this for that narrative of unprovoked attack from Russia to make any sense. And Putin goes through and explains in this interview with Tucker Carlson that he did last night exactly what the libertarians have been saying this whole time. That it's not out of mad, insane ambition that Putin has invaded Ukraine. It's through provocation from the West and from the US especially over the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah, so I didn't get a chance to listen to the interview just yet, but like I was telling you earlier, I read a few articles surrounding the interview, and even before the interview happened, it was the mainstream media was just saying like Tucker Carlson, like what an idiot, like he's crazy, like he's taking Russia's side, this and that. But like you have to give a platform to your enemies, and like you have to like let them prove their point and let the people form their view, because like Putin might, one, justify what he's done, or like at least explain it, give some insight. Two, he might come out and say, yeah, fuck the world, we're trying to take it over. Give him that platform to say it, and like then you can react or decide from there. But gagging the other gets you nowhere.
Well, if
like
you
said, as a teacher, you've got to get both sides of the story. You can't just take one side and listen to one narrative the whole time, because Ukraine can fucking start saying whatever they want then.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about it from the taxpayer point of view, now Australia committed far less money to the Ukraine war than the US did, for example, but we still committed, taxpayer funds to the US. Think about it from the taxpayer point of view, right? I am supposed to be, it's okay for them to take my taxes and use them on this war. It's fine for that. I'm okay to be used in that way. What I earned to be taken from me forcefully and then sent over to Ukraine to fight a war that I don't agree with. But I'm not mature or sensible enough to hear the other side of the story and make up my own mind.
Yeah.
Right? That's extremely disrespectful to the people of a country who are footing the bill. Right? Hey, it's all good to take what I need from you, but you're not responsible enough to make up your own mind on this. You have to decide, you have to follow what we're saying and what we're doing. I mean, that's part of it. And there's certainly...
maybe I want to send my taxpayer dollars to Russia instead. Let me choose.
Yeah. Let me choose. I wouldn't send my taxpayer dollars to Russia either.
Anyway.
Right. I mean, there's lots of things wrong with Putin, obviously. I mean, the fact that he's not democratically elected, etc. But in the context of what's happening, in the context of this war going on, all the things that might be wrong with Putin, and he is a propagandist, and he is essentially a dictator, and he's been in charge for like 20, 30 years of Russia. He's turned from, a man in his prime to an old man while in that office. And, but yeah, anyway. Let's
any highlights from the interview, Pietro? Anything
yeah,
that
let's have a
Putin
look at a
said,
couple.
or
Let's have a look at a couple of points which I quite liked. So the first one is Putin talking on what essentially is the argument that's been made against him this entire time, is that if we don't fight Putin here, he's going to invade Poland, he's going to do all the rest of these things. And Poland's kind of just like a dog whistle for a world war. Every time someone invades Poland, there's a world war. So it's kind of that, the reminiscent of Hitler and the Nazis. Let's have a look.
What is there to talk about?
Do you think NATO is worried about this becoming a global war or a nuclear conflict?
At least that's what they're talking about. And they're trying to intimidate their own population with an imaginary Russian threat. This is an obvious fact. And thinking people, not Philistines, but thinking people, analysts, those who are engaged in real politics, just smart people, understand perfectly well that this is a fake. They're trying to fuel the Russian threat.
The threat I think you're referring to is a Russian invasion of Poland, Latvia, expansionist behavior. Can you imagine a scenario where you sent Russian troops to Poland?
Only in one case, if Poland attacks Russia. Why? Because we have no interest in Poland, Latvia, or anywhere else. Why would we do that? We simply don't have any interest. It's just threat-mongering.
Well, the argument
So there you go. And the takeaway there is, and whether you believe him or not about, hey, we would never invade Poland, we've got no interest in whatsoever. But the fact is, they have no interest because pragmatically, it would be the stupidest thing they could ever do. Russia does not have this war on Russia's own border with Ukraine being bankrolled by all of the West and all the sanctions and whatnot that have been put on it and everything has already left Russia in a position of embarrassment. Like, they were supposed to win this war far more quickly, and they will most likely win this war. The Ukraine war effort is not going anywhere near as well as was being reported in the media initially, and we've spoken about that on previous episodes, how hypocritical it all is. But doesn't make any sense. It's impossible for the Russians to be able to invade anywhere else. So even if you don't believe anything that comes out of Putin's mouth, you can't deny the fact that they would never do it because it's a stupid strategic move. If nothing else, they are strategically apt. So there's obviously that.
And again, by at least giving him a platform as well to say these things, one it goes one or two ways. It kills a narrative. It should kill a narrative that, they're going to invade Latvia and Poland. But two, if he ever then did, you've got something against him. You can come out and say, well, you claimed you had no reason to go in there unless they invaded you. So you can claim he'd be going against his word. But, it'd be interesting to see what happens. Are people still going to push this narrative that, he's trying to take over the world when, they're literally just in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, if you think of, okay, so we're probably quite aware of the motives that Russia and Hitler and Putin would have had for the invasion in the first place. But you've got to think that the majority of people who listen only to the news and who only read, sort of the headlines of things and don't care about questioning the narrative, this is the first time they're encountering these ideas. So this and that kind of goes to the whole point of this interview is important more so because it even happened than for what was actually said in it. Before the interview happened, all of the media here, anywhere else, all they were saying was this right-wing ex-TV host puppet of Tucker Carlson is going to Russia to let Putin spread his propaganda, blah, blah, blah. You shouldn't listen to anything he says. You shouldn't watch it. It's going to be lies from beginning to end. This puppet of the Russians is doing this and that and blah, 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 blah. And this is because they're worried that if people tune in here, they will hear for the first time these ideas that otherwise you kind of had to do your own research to find. You kind of had to listen to dissenting voices to find. Whereas this is pretty mainstream. I mean, I think his announcement for the interview got like tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of views. Like this is bigger than any news cable show gets in terms of viewership. But still the vast majority of people won't watch it. So I think
that's what I was going to touch on. I was going to say, in terms of like, the people who consume this mainstream narrative, how many of them are actually going to go out and watch this interview in full? Probably not very many. They're going to like last night, I didn't watch it because I genuinely didn't have 2 hours to watch interviews. So like, I did a bit of Googling and found these articles summarizing it and just giving this false context of, Putin ran riot over Carlson and spread his message of hate, and Tucker Carlson allowed it. So I wonder how many people are just going to consume that instead of sitting down and watching the actual interview. And I dare say the majority.
For sure, the majority. Like anyone who's heard about this and is curious, they're not going to watch. Anyone who's heard of this is curious and is part of just, sort of the general mainstream narrative, is more likely to just, Google it and find the first article. And like, I'll tell you what, the first article that came up when I Googled it before was from the BBC, and it said, Putin takes charge as TV host gives free rein to the Kremlin. Like that's the framing of this. Not that the first Western journalist who to go there and actually try and do some journalism and not just censor this whole half of the world that has nuclear weapons and that we've been pushing and prodding towards nuclear war with for the last 2 years. Not that we've opened lines of communications and humanity and potentially trying to see a broader picture and give some nuance to all of this. No, it's that this idiot has gone and he's given free rein to the Kremlin. Like, so you can imagine that, and that's kind of part of the problem of what I think this interview has created, is that it's a really important interview, possibly one of the most important interviews given in this decade. It's in the interview itself has all of the things that we were probably expecting to hear from Putin. The ideas that he talks about, obviously the provocation and the way that the Russians, he even alludes to the deals that were made and the people who would know that Ukraine was the bright red line for the Russians. Like, he talks about, hey, ask Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State under Bush. These people were all having these conversations. They spoke openly about it, and you can find quotes from them saying, we can't touch Ukraine. We shouldn't be touching Ukraine. And over time, this got blurred, and more US hubris and ambition led to pushing further and further with NATO. But so Putin talks about lots of those things that we expected Putin to talk about. He talks about how there were negotiation deals on the table, and that Boris Johnson went and spoke to Zelenskyy and convinced him not to negotiate, which we talked about was originally reported by Fiona Hill. He talks about all of those things that you would expect Putin to talk about, and so the interview is extremely notable for that reason as well. It lays out most of the biggest arguments for why there is more nuance to this than simply Russia are psychopaths and Putin is a madman. But in saying all of that, I don't think it changes very many people's minds, because like everything else, by this point, people are entrenched in one point of view or another. Those who are entrenched in the we must support Ukraine will remain on the entrenched must support Ukraine and support foreign wars. Many of the US politicians are still a majority, are still pro-funding of Ukraine. The US population, it was already becoming less popular, so it may sway some people there, but I think by this point, it's kind of, if you thought that it was all bullshit and you thought that there was US provocation and you thought that Putin's not a nice person, but he has a point, then you're going to like this interview and you're going to agree that this interview is really important and worthwhile. If you think it's all Russian propaganda and everything's Russian propaganda and Tucker Carlson is a puppet and you believe everything that the left-wing late-night talk show people tell you about everything, then you're going to read the BBC article on it and you're going to say, hey, some douchebag went to Russia and tried to give a voice to a dictator.
I wonder if it had any sort of impact to Putin that, the whole like Western media isn't just out to get him and, you know, take a side. I wonder if it maybe convinced him that, hey, you know, maybe there are some like critical thinkers out there and people who genuinely want to hear our point of view. And I wonder if that would have much impact to him.
Well, Tucker's not Western media anymore. Is the point? I don't think it's.
Well, he's non-Russian media though.
Yes, but I don't think
Considering,
it's
yeah.
an accident that Putin chose Tucker or that Tucker chose Putin or however it came about. Like that's absolutely no accident. Like if there was one person who holds that, you know, special spot, it would have to have been either Tucker Carlson, Joe Rogan, or Lex Friedman. I think they're the only three who possibly could have fit this this niche of having a huge audience.
Good point. They'd be very, very selective. Media,
being independent media and not beholden to any powers that be, and would allow, you know, Putin to give his side of the story and would get eyeballs. I don't think it's any accident. And in fact, Tucker Carlson was kicked out of Fox. Tucker Carlson is explicitly outside of the mainstream media now, and not by choice, because he was too questioning of the powers that be and of the narrative throughout especially through his last year with Fox. He was really going rogue, and he's gone even more rogue now, which is fantastic, obviously, for questioning the power structures and the establishment. And also, like, we know that Putin did heaps of homework on Tucker Carlson. He says, he asks him, they bring up the CIA throughout countless times throughout the interview. And at one point, the first time they bring it up, Putin goes, "Oh, that's right, the organization that you tried to join when you were younger," which is kind of both a dig at Tucker saying like, "Haha, you used to want to join for those, you used to want to work for those pieces of shit," but also, hey,
we
know everything, right? I've looked into you, motherfucker. Don't you try to trip me up. Which was a cool moment, and a kind of a reminder of quite how, like, you're watching the interview. And the first 30 minutes is Putin monologuing on Russian history for the last 1,000 years. Like, my eyes were glazing over. I was really getting quite bored of all this. I mean, it's stuff I don't know. I'm not going to recall it after hearing it once. So it's not really, and it's not really relevant. I mean, 1,000 years ago is not really relevant.
But it's not relevant. But I did see a little side-by-side comparison video where it was or like just like meme of Putin, like, you know, rattling off 30 minutes of Russian history, and then Biden just standing there going, like, forgetting where he is, and it's like,
which is the more competent
I wouldn't want either as my leader, but, you know, one is certainly a lot more competent than the other.
But like, so the interview has these moments where it's kind of like it gets a bit long-winded and whatnot, and you almost forget quite how, you know, intense the whole situation is. And then when Putin, you know, it's Tucker with the, "Hey, I know where you came from, I know about you," it kind of reminds you, it's like, oh shit, that's right. You know, this interview
is a powerful human being.
This is a powerful human being, and this interview is very much about the relation between two of the biggest, most powerful countries in the world.
I wonder if Tucker feared like not leaving, if he was like, right, I could become a political prisoner here. Hey, actually, on that, one of the things I saw in all the mainstream media articles was like, because Tucker brought up, I to be honest, I'd never heard of this guy, a political prisoner that Russia are holding, an American guy, Evan somebody.
Yeah, Evan Gershkovich.
Yeah, so Russia are holding him, and all these mainstream media articles who are hanging shit on Tucker interviewing Putin were like, it took him over 2 hours before he even brought this up. What the fuck? Do you want him to go straight into the interview like, "Oh, hi, Vladimir, what about that political prisoner?" Like, like, cool, bang, see you later. This is all you want from me.
I'm sorry, the headline there is that Tucker Carlson, who's supposed to be this Russian puppet, brought up this extremely awkward topic for Putin, which is like very much at his own risk, you know. And the question is, why did it take him 2 hours into this interview? Well, first of all, because Putin monologues for the first 30 minutes, and then second of all, because there's this war that we've been funding for 2 years to the tune of, you know, the US probably $1 trillion plus. And we need to figure out whether it's just that it's happening and whether we should continue to fund it and whether there was any provocation for it. And then, then the next topic is, we mentioned this thing about someone that's kind of awkward. They criticized him also on he doesn't bring up things like, hey, what's with your elections, Putin? What's with that? But I mean, you can understand why he doesn't. And also, it's like the topics to do with Putin that are covered in the Western media are all those topics. Like, we know these things about him being corrupt and about their government not being democratic and whatnot. The things we don't know are the ones that Tucker has the spotlight to be able to highlight.
Exactly.
Let's look at something else I found interesting about the interview, which I suppose I could have known. Like, we could have known. But at one point, Putin mentions that he hasn't spoken to Biden since before the war broke out. And like, they used to speak, and he talks about all the presidents and the relationship that he had with most of them. And I think he speaks most highly of, he speaks highly of George Bush, and he says that everyone in the US makes fun of him, but he found him to be an impressive man, which is, I don't know what to make of that, because Bush is kind of seen as this buffoon. And he talks quite highly of Trump, which I'm sure doesn't help any of Trump's cases for why he's not a Russian asset, even though they've largely been disproven now. But that, especially if he'd said that 4 or 5 years ago, that would have really not helped Trump's case. But he speaks quite highly of Trump, much more so than any Democrat presidents. And he mentions that he hasn't spoken to Biden since the war broke out, which, again, we could have assumed, but it's such a worrying situation. Like, wouldn't you think that the one thing you'd want to keep open with the absolute biggest threat to all of humanity being, nuclear war, and the US and Russia being the two biggest nuclear powers and flirting with it at various points throughout history? Don't you think at the very least you would keep communications open? I'm not saying call each other every week, but they haven't spoken. And his office hasn't spoken with Biden's office since the start of the war. So in over 2 years, the two biggest world powers do not communicate because of a border war in Russia. Like, it's not a hot war that America's involved in. In fact, America is pretending to be very much not involved, other than, hey, we're sending aid and troops and not troops, sorry, and funding and stuff. So I don't know. I found that I suppose it didn't surprise me, but I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought whether they communicate with each other, and hearing that was kind of.
And like you said, it's their offices as well. It's not literally Putin and Biden having a chat over the phone. It's America and Russia chatting, isn't it? It's government to government that hasn't spoken at all, which is even more bizarre.
What they've communicated through is, instead of actual conversations, is the US largely lying about all sorts of things to do with Russia, including the Nordstream Pipeline, including the two missiles that landed in Poland, and immediately Ukraine and the US media said that it was Russian missiles, flirting with this idea that okay, because Poland is a NATO country, now we have to go into a hot war. And Zelenskyy immediately came out and said that, and then it turned out not to be true. It turned out that they were Ukrainian missiles, but that's how the US has been communicating with Russia.
Communicated by proxy and communicated by actions.
Yeah, communicating by actions, propaganda, and proxy.
Yeah,
rather than two people talking or two administrations talking to each other. That's so much more. That's so irresponsible.
And I understand it's extremely complex, but it's at the same time, it's any issue in the world, personal life, especially, the best way to sort things out is literally just to talk about it.
Yeah, we know that on a personal level. If you're disagreeing with someone, the best way to keep that going is to let it fester and not talk to them, and just kind of give each other bad looks every now and again and blow each other's pipelines. The minute you talk to each other, the disagreement kind of dissipates, or you have a fist fight and get it over and done with.
Oh, jeez.
I mean, not that I've had that many fist fights. I don't think I've had a fist fight since primary school. So
that example of the kids getting in the fight at school you're talking about, that was you versus a kid, wasn't it?
I was, yeah, I was the one that got hit in the back of the head.
Yeah.
Anyway, I did have another clip to show about Putin, but I reckon we've kind of said it all. The other clip that I was going to show, we can just talk about. So Putin talks about what the US is doing by sanctioning Russia and therefore pushing Russia to use, its own money and, the yen and whatnot. And it's pushing the US dollar into a less dominating position, which the US relies on. Like the US is in enormous debt and is an enormous consumer economy. Like it relies on its dollar having this esteem and having this dominant nation on a world stage. And the fact that they're pushing Russia away with sanctions and whatnot has led to a further weakening in the US dollar. And Putin kind of points out, he's like, hey, like your dollar is crumbling. You've got an immigration problem, which is now actually coming to a head in the US in a very real way with the border crisis. You have the border crisis, which has been a problem since Trump got elected because he ran on that. Like that was how significantly it was impacting people's lives, is that he won an election on that, 8 years ago. And he sort of points all these problems out with the US, which I thought was interesting, especially because like he speaks with more nuance about the US situation and the precarious position that the US is in than any of the Biden administration. And I don't know, it just feels like we're dealing with a much more competent, I'm not going to say he's obviously not a good person, but he's a much more competent leader than Biden. And I mean, Biden's definitely not a good person. Biden's hardly a person at all at the moment. I mean, he's mostly a cocktail of, drugs and prompt screens and whatnot.
Hey, talking about migration issue, did you see that bit of footage of like there's some Democrat in the Senate or something over there claiming all of Trump's ideas with the wall, and like he was floating these ideas basically. I think all the claims were false. It was like, oh, Trump said we're going to put an alligator moat alongside the wall. Trump's going to electrify it. We're going to like cut people off at the knees when they try and jump it. And I don't think he said any of that, but everyone was just like, it's actually not a bad idea. Let's fucking build a moat next to the wall and just riddle it with alligators. That'll stop the migration issue easily.
Well, I mean, I know that the left has, the Democrats have recently been attacking Trump on the fact that he promised a wall and didn't deliver, ignoring the fact that they denigrated him and denied him any chance at delivering on that for the entire presidency that he had.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, oh, well, we definitely need that wall that you talked about. Where is it? You promised us a wall while they've been tearing it down. I mean, the hypocrisy there is just absurd.
That's just politics, It's just whatever the other person does, it's wrong. And then when they do it and then don't deliver it, it's,
exactly.
you didn't do your job properly. Hey, I was there like a few months ago. The wall, for the most part, at least along California, is well and truly there.
Nice.
And
there it was at least part of a wall.
Drove along past it. I just went through a border crossing into Mexico. You can get into Mexico easy. They don't even check your passport or anything. We went in. Hey, just a little side story of getting how easy it is to get into Mexico. We crossed the border by car, didn't get checked for anything, and then was in Mexico for like a week before I was getting an internal flight and was like, I better do the right thing and, try and get stamped in and let them know. And then just got roasted by this fucking like government official. Like, you need to get stamped in. Why didn't you get stamped in? You're here illegally. Whenever you go to a country, you cross the border, you get stamped in. And I was like, they didn't fucking check me. They just waved me in. Like, I'm doing the right thing by coming to you to get stamped in. Stop yelling at me.
Yeah.
And then I didn't get checked once. Even when I left Mexico, they didn't even check that I'd ever been like stamped in or paid $60 for this fucking tourist card. Like,
it's pretty funny, the idea of Mexico worrying about illegal immigration into it.
True.
The other thing I wanted to talk about is something that happened about a week and a half ago, which was that very much an idol of this show, Dave Smith, the libertarian podcaster and comedian, had on his podcast for, I think, the second time, RFK Jr., the who's now running independent in the US election, who was fantastic on the Ukraine war, and he was one of all of those points that I made before about things that people were saying about why the US provoked Russia and all of these other things. RFK was making these points. RFK was absolutely spot on all of these. I should have mentioned him among that list of other people before. But now on the Israel Gaza thing, suddenly he is warmongering. And I think there's this one, and Dave Smith essentially, and if you haven't seen it, I suggest that you do. Part of the problem is the name of the podcast, and they go at it for an hour, and it's intense. And RFK essentially makes the case for why Israel needs the US funding, and Dave Smith pokes holes in it, and it's very entertaining, to be honest, and it's well worth a watch. But I think it very much hurts RFK and his campaign, and I mean, half of what was so likable about him, if not more than half, was that he was the anti-war candidate. I mean, he'd been correct on all the COVID stuff. He was great on all the COVID stuff, all the nuance there, anti-Fauci, anti-lockdowns, all the rest of it. Was great on Ukraine. He's not a libertarian. He's not perfect on like free market and stuff. But I think this is it's just such a huge blind spot in his ideology.
It was a really interesting conversation. It was probably like the most respectfully disrespectful interview ever. Like half the interview was like, Dave Smith going, look, you're so good on all these topics, but you're a fucking idiot on this. And it's just like, and
he's calling him sir the whole time. Is sir, that is absolutely false. You are lying through your teeth. Let's have a clip from this, because this is I think this is one of the most telling, if not the most telling point of the interview.
I don't agree with that, but okay. Do you have concerns about the level of Israeli influence in our politics here in the United States of America?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a politician in political office, so I don't see much of that.
Wow. So I listened to this, but I didn't watch it. Watching it for the first, like when I listened to it, I was like, oh, has it paused by itself? Like I went to check it, and I was like, oh no, it's still playing, and then RFK starts talking. Watching that is awkward.
Yeah. So there's no lag between them on the podcast at any point in the show, right? They're responding to each other, and in fact talking over each other, constantly trying to interrupt each other's points. There's no 3-4 second lag while one person talks for the other one to be hearing what they're saying. And that wasn't 3 or 4 seconds.
7 or 8.
Like 7 or 8 seconds that RFK is sitting there churning through his brain. And what a lot of people have taken out of this is, okay, he's really good and sees all the nuance in this other stuff, but I mean, clearly he's thinking about it, and he knows that he can't talk against the Israel lobby. He is in some way compromised by the Israel lobby, because there's no way that you can deny that. Like, I mean, the fact that we have to support Israel is on so many of the politicians in the US's to-do list, is because so many of them are funded, and there is so much influence from the Israel lobby in the US. It's undeniable, and he knows. The thing is, the reason there's a pause is because he knows that he knows that he could either say yes, and for whatever reason, there's some compromise, there's some funding he won't get, there's some deal he's made, there's something that will come back and bite him, or he can say no and completely lie, or he ends up working out the third way, which is I don't know, which is absolutely not true. Like he knows, he knows, and that's kind of the crux of it, and it's led a lot of people to speculate that he is in some way compromised. And I think, I mean, that along with the tweet that he made on the day of, I think it was the attacks, the Hamas attacks on Israel. What was it, October 7th or whatever it was? The tweet he made in immediate support. We need to do everything we can. We must send everything we can. And it was so completely opposite to what he'd been saying about Ukraine.
And it was regardless, there's no way you could like have enough context on that certain attack to come out so instantly and make these outrageous calls.
Yes. There's also that. Yeah. On day dot, he immediately had his decision, and he immediately had that we have to fund this war and we have to support this to the very end.
We've spoken about it before, and it's not just RFK. So many people were really good on the like Russia-Ukraine war, like their stances, but then all of a sudden, like the Israel-Palestine conflict, so many people show their true colors. So many people are just like ready, like to take a side. It's us versus them, and Ugh, sickening.
And another thing that kind of was highlighted in that is that RFK and Dave Smith go through for a long period of like 30, 40 minutes. They go through like the history. And same with Putin. There's a reason that Putin talked for 30 minutes about the history of Ukraine and Russia and whatnot. And there's this, it's kind of like everyone in every situation is using history to justify their point of view. And that's exactly how you've got to do it. But we're at a point where you can have these two people, RFK and Dave Smith, going at each other for 30 minutes with two competing views of history, and neither of them will convince the other one. You can kind of use whichever view of history you would like to support the point that the argument that you want to make. So someone who is in some way corrupted, or in some way has the Israel lobby hanging over them, can find a view of history and can find people who can make the case to end up arriving at that conclusion. It's when you start with what you want the outcome of your actions to be, and then you decide how it was that you arrived to there. You can justify anything. You can justify anything. And I mean, clearly there is a very powerful Israel lobby that wants the US and wants the rest of the world to back Israel with funding and war and its decimation of Gaza, regardless. And they'll give you the history notes. They'll give you the talking points if you want them. Like they'll give them to you. It's there.
From that interview as well, one thing I took away is that like RFK is like he's not going to be elected, but he's ready to be elected. He was doing the standard politician like answer, talking about the conflict, and was like, he did the whole, I've got friends in Palestine. I've got all these friends here and there. It's like, no, you don't.
Well, and the other thing that a lot of people said was that he the reason he went on Dave Smith's podcast, and Dave Smith is probably the biggest libertarian voice at the moment, not just in the US but in the world, with the exception maybe of Javier Milei and potentially I don't know if there's any others. But the reason he went on there, and the reason he went on there to argue this specific thing, was that he has been angling for the Libertarian Party's nomination to be the Libertarian Party candidate in the US. And there was a lot of talk about potentially letting him do this, especially prior to the Israel thing. And the reason that he would want this is because as the third party, the Libertarian Party gets ballot access on all 50 states. So his name would appear on all 50 states, whereas as an independent, he wouldn't. So he was there's a lot of talk about the whole reason why he went on to do this is the fact that he was trying to get, by getting Dave Smith on his side, he would convince the Libertarian Party to run him as a candidate.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Which I think that's not going to happen, especially given the fact that Dave Smith gave him so much.
Not after that interview.
Yeah, gave him so much. What's the word? Pushback.
Stick.
Go on.
I can't remember the exact context, but there was one point when they were talking about all that history when RFK, he was talking about war crimes. Yeah. And he was using World War II as some sort of example. And then Dave Smith was like, these war crimes didn't exist until after World War II. Like the reason they exist is because of World War II. And that was really intense because Dave Smith was basically just saying, you don't know what you're talking about. Like you think you know what you're talking about, but you were like vehemently wrong on this because that was very interesting.
Well, and I think, all sorts of stuff like that. You can slightly twist like, hey, these war crimes, and probably that they come into effect from World War II, but you slightly twist and they don't pick up on it, you get away with a point.
Sure, they may have been morally wrong before they came into law.
Yeah.
Not to say that law is always the like definitive answer of like things being right or wrong. But like, geez, come on, RFK. Like,
yeah.
If you're going to use it as a point, you probably need to know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. One last thing we wanted to show before we go. We only have a couple of minutes, so I'll be really quick with it. So, given all this talk about competent leadership, and RFK is competent, his brain did shut down a little bit there for about 7 or 8 seconds while he thought of the appropriate response. But I'm pretty sure his brain was thinking during that time. He was making a decision. There was something going on upstairs.
He was conscious.
Let's see what's been happening with the leader of the free world, Mr. Joe Biden. So one last clip we'll roll through.
Leader of the free mind.
There is some movement, and I don't want to, well, maybe choose my words. There's some movement. There's been a response from there's been a response from the opposition, but yes, I'm sorry, from Hamas, but it seems to be a little over the top. We're not sure where it is. There's a continuing negotiation right now.
So I've seen that clip before. I don't think you've seen that clip before. Let me know what your thoughts are on that.
Went 200% retard.
I mean, I got to the point where he was struggling so much that when he says continuing negotiations at the end, I was impressed. I was impressed that he said continuing negotiations because
big words.
He couldn't remember Hamas for like 30 seconds. And then someone gives him the name Hamas and he still drones out for another like 10 seconds. Then he says continued opposition. And I'm thinking, oh, damn, Biden, there's something going on up there. You can string two syllable words together.
Geez, there's been a lot of stick on him the last few days about his memory and his competence. And I'm a little bit worried because I don't know if it's like orchestrated to time before the election and, maybe get him overthrown and have someone who's more competent in his place.
Every day that we get closer is harder for them to put someone else in there, I think.
Yeah, exactly. But I got to say, credit to Biden for one thing. When he was being grilled by some journalists, they asked him about his memory. How's your memory doing? And it was quite like a lot of people were taking the angle of like, oh my God, I can't believe he said this. He is like fully retarded. But I thought it was quite clever of him. He goes, yeah, maybe my memory isn't very good. I keep letting you in here to ask me questions. And I was like, that's probably the best thing he's ever said.
Yeah, that's clever, Biden. Yeah. I mean, that's the point we're at with him is like, if he says something slightly witty or if he, comes up with half of a sentence, we're like, wow, dude, there's something still in there. There's some neurons still kicking around in that old brain of yours.
Just like one functioning sentence per day.
Yeah. All right, let's leave it there for today. We've talked enough shit. Thank you very much for listening. Those of you who are still here, if you don't already, you can follow us on Instagram, Spotify, YouTube, and Twitter. Any last thoughts, Max?
I think am I the foreign correspondent now?
Well, I mean, you're around the corner from where I am, so it'd be...
Reporting live from the border of Ukraine, Russia, and Israel. Yeah. There's actually a point where all three of those meet. We just haven't realized yet.
Wow, and that place looks an awful lot like your room here in Victoria.
I'm going to change my background.
Amazing how you've made you made it look so similar, so homely. All right, catch you later, everyone. Peace.
See ya.